Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here in the Willis Building at the LBS Energy Summit. And I hope today we're going to have a very interesting and sustained debate. We've got a fantastic panel for you of some of the people who have a really good grip of what's going on in the industry, what's going on in the markets. They have had a tremendous degree of experience. I calculated that between them, they've got something like 200 years experience. So they should be able to tell you some idea of what's going to go on with shale gas, what's going to happen next, and how it's going to impact markets, industries, and indeed your lives. So without further ado, let me just take you through the panel. But first, we've got Atle Rettedal here from he's from Statoil. He's senior VP, tremendous experience in the industry, great insight, great strategic knowledge. Next to him, we've got Benjamín Palomo-Sanz. Have I got your name right?
More or less.
More or less, thank you. The English inability to pronounce properly. I apologise for that. He's Director of LNG at Repsol. LNG is a crucial element of the development of shale gas in global markets, and he is certainly the person you go to ask about LNG. Next to him, we've got Ford Nicholson. Now, Ford is what do you talk about Ford? 25 years in the industry, tremendous knowledge of global energy markets, and a key industry investor. And Ford can give us, I think, an overview kind of globally and into the US and Canadian markets, as well as what's going on to some degree in Europe as well. Next to him, we have got Michael O'Dwyer from Morgan Stanley, an energy investor from one of the big houses, tremendous experience, great insight, and I'm sure will give us a robust view of the state of the markets and the potential for investment. And finally, last but not least, we have Simon Whitehead, perhaps one of the great strategic public affairs directors of our generation, with a tremendous knowledge of the energy industry, and also this ability to see not merely what's going to happen in the next year or two, but also the kind of broad strategic direction and trend of the energy markets, both in Europe and further afield. So we've got a really great panel for you on shale gas. The questions you've got in your mind will probably start off with, if you've seen the film Gasland, is this potential for terrible environmental degradation. And certainly that has been a theme across Europe over the last couple of years. And it is clearly true that you can have environmental issues in relation to shale gas exploration, production, and development. But one of the issues which I think you come to realise after a degree of examination of the papers and the documentation and the analysis provided by a wide range of academic and technical sources, is that the environmental issues to deal with the drilling and the actual production are manageable and able to be dealt with in a sort of fairly straightforward fashion, as long as you use best practice. And this is the view of the International Energy Agency. But there are a number of other environmental issues which we will have to grapple with. One of the major ones, I think, is scalability, is of agencies going from having dealing with one well, or 5 wells, up to 300, 400, 1,000. Scalability is a major issue. There are questions also simply about the ability in water-stressed areas of the world to deal with water issues. There are a whole series of questions about regulatory capacity. And there's a broader issue, which is, I think, something which is often overlooked, and that is this question of the ability of states with traditionally very little regulatory capacity, very little sound public administration, being able to carry out these intensive regulatory supervision. And that is perhaps one of the areas which we will really have to look at in the future. I think the overarching question, though, is in relation to gas complacency. And that is, if we have huge amounts of gas on the planet, then one of the questions that really flows forward is this. If you've got lots of cheap gas and easy access to the cheap gas in the years to come, what then happens to the whole CO2 project? How do you deal with climate change? Do we just sit there with large amounts of gas and use that rather than anything else? That's certainly a question of gas complacency. And how do we deal with that going forward. On the flip side, we are looking potentially at huge amounts of gas, perhaps not immediately, but further down the line for the whole planet. This could be very good in terms of obviously supply security, but it could also have potentially stunning geostrategic and economic consequences. Let me give you one which was put by me a few weeks ago, and it is this. If you have huge amounts of gas on the planet, then can you have not merely gas transportation for fleet vehicles, but can you use the natural gas networks in the homes to fuel CNG gas-fired vehicles for everybody? And you use compression devices for a few $100s in every garage in the United States and Europe, and you use the natural gas supply, the domestic natural gas supply, to feed your car. So every home becomes a filling station. Think of the economic and geostrategic implications of that. Think also of the fact you get zero air pollution and you get a 30% cut in CO2 emissions from domestic transportation. Now, that's one issue which was thrown up with the potential of shale gas. But I'm not here to hog the floor. I'm here to get people to come up with some answers to some good questions. We've got some good questions to start. And I'm going to start with one now. With Atle, I've got the first question, I think, is for you. And that's whether you think the shale gas boom is replicable in Europe. What do you think?
Well, if I am to give a very short answer to that, the answer is no. Uh-huh. And in order to make it a bit more interesting, I need to elaborate a little bit, sure. I think. It's no. Yep. It's no because of geological reasons. It's simply not the same structures as in the US. So in Europe, it cannot be as big in the US. That's just given. However, it's perfectly possible that there will be regions in Europe where you can have significant gas.
Well, one of the questions I'd like to follow up on that particular issue is this, is that one of the issues, I think the issue of the geology is fundamental in it. If you don't have the total organic content, if you don't have the shale gas, which is significantly gas-bearing, clearly you can't develop the shale gas. That's one of the fundamentals. But there are kind of other fundamentals as well. I mean, one of the arguments by why the UK might be a much more attractive place to develop is because of the natural gas we had from the North Sea. We spent $20 billion building an entire national infrastructure. So if there is any shale gas to be developed in the UK, we can simply plug it in. We don't have the immense cost barrier of building a network. Mm. And of course the question is one of the questions you have to ask is, in whichever state you're looking at, is do you have a network you can plug it into?
I think if you compare today with the alternatives to potential shale discoveries in Europe, for the oil companies, we need to go to more kind of harsh environments, longer distance from kind of the markets, meaning, for instance, the Arctic or far north, or deeper waters, which will be more expensive. So that means that the break-even of shale is quite kind of likely competitive with some of these resources. And if you have the resource kind of in the midst of your distribution network, you have a good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments about the UK is the fact that you've got in the Vale of Bowland quadrilla, the resource base, so we understand, is very, very deep. It's about 5,000 feet thick. The Marcellus Shale, which is the great shale being developed in the eastern seaboard of the United States, is 350 feet thick. So the potential resource base is apparently enormous. So if you have that, plus you have the existing infrastructure, you've got some possibilities. I mean, that may or may not work out, but the point about it is that you need all of these things lined up to make them work. Any more thoughts?
No, I think when it comes to shale, the example you alluded to with UK, with shale, it's like multiplication, and you have to multiply a number of factors. And if any one of those factors is zero, the financial outcome will be zero. And yes, there are some deep, thick structures in UK, but you don't know kind of how producible they will be, so there are still question marks. I think in Europe, compared to the US, we also have the social acceptance issue, of course, because in Europe, the rights to the minerals belongs to the government. while in the US it belongs to the people owning the land. So there's a personal incentive that's very, very different. And it's also more environmental concern in Europe. And as you mentioned, regulation is not yet developed in all countries where they have potentially shale. So that will also take some time. But I think personally this will not mean that we will not do it, but maybe the timing of it will it will come a bit later. It'll take some time before we have decided to do so on a more state level.
Yeah, I think I've got two things I want to say. One is that I think one of my research interests in all of this is the fact that what I think you see is because essentially the Crown or the state owns all the subsoil rights, as you say, it creates a huge disincentive to develop. But one of the factors you may find is that you start looking at perhaps potentially giving the local authorities or local communities a percentage of the shareholdings to actually give them an interest in it. Because one of the arguments is with unconventional gas as opposed to conventional is that the level of disruption is greater and the local community, that has to be recognised some way in the compensation to the local communities. And that could actually result in a kind of change in the way the sort of legal models you need to compensate people in the areas where this is being developed. So I think that's one of the interesting questions I think going forward. Any more thoughts about that? Or?
No, I think I agree with you. There must be some incentive for the people being exposed to the shale production somehow. It cannot be like it's only benefiting the whole society. There needs to be something for the people having a drilling rig in their backyard. There must be some positive elements apart from the site, of course.
Okay, well, can we move on then? Thanks very much. Can we move on to Benjamin? Right. Well, the question aspect we have for you really is about, because one of the real impacts of LNG in the moment, shale gas in Europe at the moment, is effectively the diversion effect of shale gas, LNG, which was supposed to go to the United States, coming to Europe instead of being dumped on European markets. And do you think this is something which is going to be going forward? Do you think we're going to have a situation where the exports lead to price conversion across the markets? Will we get a global price for gas?
Well, difficult. Following the steps of my distinguished colleague, I will say the straight answer is no, and then I will elaborate a bit. In my view, the future price developments will be conditioned by imbalances throughout the world, not by the US LNG exports that, in my view, will be significant but not determining of the market in the future. If you look at the number of projects that are under consideration, there are already like 16 projects in the US plus 3 in Canada. Out of the 16 in the US, 11 have approval for exports into free trade agreement countries. And there is only one with the approval for exports into non-free trade agreement countries. And the difficulty is that the only significant market in the free trade agreement countries is Korea. And Korea has got a capacity or an import volume of about 50 BCMA. And the combined production of the 11 projects with approval is over 100 million tons, which means that they don't have a market, basically. Now, the next step would be getting approval for export to the rest of the world. And in the rest of the world, you've got countries like Japan, who is the biggest importer, and Taiwan, Spain, Europe in general. So there is that is where the market is. But the difficulty is that the Department of Energy in the US doesn't seem to be in a hurry to grant these approvals. And even the approval that they have granted to Sabine Pass is conditioned to the scenario that they have taken into consideration to grant this approval. So it could be removed eventually. And the reason why they are not in a hurry to grant these permits is because every permit for exports into non-free trade agreement countries has to meet the test of being in the public interest. And that is a difficult one. And there is a lot of discussion about the issues why it is not in the public interest to export natural gas from the US. The first argument is that exporting natural gas will increase local prices. And obviously, they don't want that to happen in the interest of the public. The second argument is that there is a lot of industrialists that believe that America should exploit her competitive advantage with free or very, very cheap gas rather than exporting the resource. And in that way create American jobs instead of exporting their advantage. A third argument is that natural gas, of course, is the greenest of the three fossil fuels, with CO2 emissions of about 50% of coal for the same energy content, and about 75% of the emissions of liquids. And therefore, what they say is that for environmental reasons, part of this demand that is covered by coal and liquids in the US should be converted into gas to reduce CO2 emissions. And finally, the green argument is that given the environmental effects of, or perceived to be associated with the production of shale gas, it doesn't make any sense to create pollution at home to export the natural gas abroad. So for all these reasons, I believe that, and for others that are more in relation to the practicality of the expansion of the shale gas production to other areas, I believe that things like production in Australia or Eastern Africa will be a lot more significant in the development of the gas market globally in the future.
Okay, that's great, thanks. Well, onward now to Ford. And I've got the question I've got for Ford is on the simply about the shale gas industry in the United States. Do we think that the impact that shale gas has had, do you think it's sustainable?
I won't choose answer no. There's a lot of parts to that. Sustainable. Shale wells are different. Let's understand what shale is for just a moment. Shale is the source rock. It's the kitchen. It's where all the oil and gas comes from. So we understand what it is. Shale gas, most of the gas coming from Gazprom to supply Europe is shale gas. It's just been trapped in a sand structure. So it's the same kind of gas. It's just harder to get to. That's what's tricky. It's an unconventional item to attack. In terms of sustainable, I think, just in terms of my cost of capital and what we're applying in drilling wells in the US and in other parts of the world, shale wells come on at arguably they have to come on at commercial rates, ideally, but they come off at quite a steep decline. And we saw this massive push in shale gas in the US, and we keep talking about shale gas. There's shale oil, shale gas, and there's combinations. So shale will produce, depending on the organic content we talked about earlier, it'll cook to a certain temperature and begin to produce oil. You cook it further, it starts to turn into condensate. You keep cooking it underground and under pressure, and it turns into natural gas. And if it continues to be cooked, it turns into CO2. So shale gas, shale oil, and the combination of that which comes from it. When these wells come on, they come on very strong, and then they decline quite rapidly. So it's all about extracting your cost of capital out in a very short term. Bit of a long answer to the question, but effectively, you've seen this enormous capital outpouring into shale gas in the US, the Haynesville Shale in particular, Barnett initially, and then the Haynesville, the Fayetteville shales. And you saw this collapse in pricing in gas, and you saw the industry then move to more oil-rich, liquids-rich gas or shales. And I think the industry is caught or doomed to this boom-bust echo, where you're going to see an industry grapple with unusual decline rates in these production profiles. So traditional oil and gas out of what I would call a regular reservoir comes on and has a much slower decline than the kind of decline in production you have from shale gas. The U.S. has seen an explosive growth in natural gas, a lot of wells shut in, primarily because we were talking about earlier about the land is held by the landowners, and it was required that a well was drilled on each 640-acre section to hold the ground. It's called HBPing the ground, hold by production of the ground. All this ground was drilled up with one well per section, where you could drill as many as 7 or 8, and it caused an explosion in production, and the price came off. There is an enormous amount of gas and oil still sitting in the United States. I'm not so sure I agree with the idea that the U.S. will get to total self-sufficiency, but it will certainly get to the point where I think they can withdraw the U.S. Fifth Fleet out of the Persian Gulf, which has, to your point, significant implications globally. When they can say we're pulling back. But I think, going back to sustainable, I think that America is likely, and there's talk about this in Washington, to take this enormous dividend, if you will, that was, I'll say, more luck than design, thankfully to George Mitchell and his family's pursuits in the 90s to find shale gas. And they will move towards, careful on the sustainable, I think they'll move towards third-generation nuclear. They'll take an awful lot of this capital, take this push in the next 20, 30 years, and move that capital to a more nuclear format. So in terms of this dividend, I think that it is a piece of the energy puzzle in the U.S., which will translate into a much longer-term perspective for the U.S. I believe that it's not unlike, if you will, Maggie Thatcher, to your country. I've lived here 13 years. You think about Maggie Thatcher, there's a movie, The Iron Lady, that came out here not too long ago. There was no talk about oil and gas in there, which I think back on. I was living here in the 70s, and income tax rates were 70 or 80%. In reality, Maggie became the tough lady that she was because she had this huge energy dividend that came out of the North Sea. It came from basically 0 to 6 million barrels a day by 1984. She had a balance sheet. She was able to convert Britain from an industrial society to a service economy. They had this huge amount of firepower that came to them. I look at this, and what the U.S. is doing today, to your point about the exportability, there's this opportunity for them to really think carefully about how long they can sustain it and what they can do with that dividend. You said no on the aspect of this harmonization, I guess, of gas prices on a global basis, but I would say to you on gas, correct. So they may not export the gas, but because America is not exporting natural gas, they're bulldozing. There's 650 coal-fired power plants in the United States. They're bulldozing one every 6 days, flattening them, every 6 days, flattening them. And what's happening? They're converting them all to combined cycle natural gas, the front end. What's the alternative? There's not harmonization of gas prices, they're not exporting it, but all the excess coal is coming to Europe. So there is a big impact in Europe. Here's America, who didn't sign up to the Kyoto Protocol, and they're getting this huge dividend. They're going to make the Kyoto Protocol, not Europe. Yep. And we're unloading our coal to you guys. Wow. Who would have thought? So to energy industry, U.S. energy sustainability, I think that the Americans are thinking very carefully about the pain they've gone through since the 70s, as Europe is. I think Europe's in a much more difficult position, and I think that they are going to think through how to talk about generating energy sustainability from this dividend that's coming from shale gas. Is that a good answer?
That's great.
There you go.
Okay, now we should move swiftly on. And I think for the next question, we're moving on to Michael. And the question we got here is, do you think now the shale gas boom has gone on for some while, can it still be a good investment? Or are companies who missed the boom now doomed to much lower returns? What do you think?
Well, I think the answer is both, and I'll elaborate on that as well. I think clearly the companies that got in at the ground floor, and we're talking only a matter of a few years ago, so 4, 5, 6 years ago, who bought acreage across some of the emerging and very nascent shale plays at the time, have made incredible returns. They bought acreage at hundreds of dollars per acre and sold at thousands of dollars per acre. And so clearly those days, I think by and large are gone. People have become a lot more smart. People have identified where the new areas are emerging and are capitalizing on that and have really, I think, sewn up a lot of the very early stage acreage. That's not to say, however, that the days of making money in shale gas or unconventional oil have in any way diminished. If you look at the market today, the companies that have identified the best resources are still making a lot of money. I think you have to put this in context. If we talk about a number of maybe 2,000 TCF of gas in North America, which is, the numbers vary dramatically, but if you take a number like that as the total resources in North America, about half of that is economic, below $4 per MCF. About a third of it is economic, below $3 per MCF. Above that, a lot becomes economic. So if you're sitting today in one of those resources that's economic at $6 per MCF, that's not worth a lot to you today. If you're sitting in one that's worth $3, it's still worth something, and if it's break even $2, then it's worth a lot to you. And what determines the break-even price? Well, first and foremost, it's geology. And the geology is vastly different, not just from play to play, but also within plays. And there are acres within plays that are very economic and very attractive. And there are acres outside of the core sweet spot that are very unattractive. I think the logistic network and the ability to evacuate gas and export gas from an area is incredibly important. And that has a big impact on your break-even price. I think your location and the proximity to interesting markets. So for instance, the Marcellus Shale in the Northeast that was referred to earlier is one of the most attractive shales available because it's on the doorstep of New York and Boston, Pittsburgh, and therefore the cost of transport to those local markets is quite low. So the returns that can be made, and if you look at the capital markets and if you look at how companies trade, there's a very clear bifurcation between those companies that are in the premier shale areas, and Marcellus is one, and the Eagle Ford Shale is another, and there are several, compared to those who are in the high cost and therefore low return areas. And they trade accordingly, and the market is efficient enough to differentiate between the two. So I think in answer to your question, I think certainly money has been made, and huge amounts of money have been made in shale gas by investors, but there's a lot of money to be made by investors. And I think that will continue for many years to come.
Thank you very much. Okay, Simon, we've got a question for you. I originally mentioned Gasland, and there's been a huge argument in Europe about shale gas, all of the impacts on the environment. I think the question is really, what are the real issues? Should we be worried that if I put a little light on here, we'll get a flame? What are the real issues, and how do you manage all of this?
Well, Alan, I think it's very easy if you're in the business of communications and crafting the message around shale gas or natural gas from shale to argue on the side of Josh Fox. That's because it's all about emotion. It's all about playing on people's fears. And what I think one has to do is to try and argue it the other way around, because that is a much more interesting intellectual argument and a much more interesting form of communication. I mean, there is no emotional response which will balance with Josh Fox. It's just not there at the moment. And I think the way that he ran his campaign in the early days, going on tours around cities, around the United States and then around Europe, whipping up people with video and scare stories, was incredibly strong. And he set the tone at a time when there was the gold rush going on in the United States, and it was beginning to infect into Europe. Tempers have really cooled a bit since Gasland 1, and we're eagerly waiting for Gasland 2 to be released. It's been promised later this year, it's been promised. Still haven't quite seen it. There have been some interim videos. But I think if you look at the way that the United States has come forward Tempers have cooled in Europe to a degree, and the hysteria that has gone on has cooled to a degree. I think there are some very obvious tactics that need to be put in place if you are essentially communicating around this subject. The first is, and this is public relations 101, you have to present the evidence. The evidence is really all that matters here if you're arguing pro-natural gas from shale. And if you look at what the United States might produce if the boom continues and if there isn't a complete bust here, you're looking at 800,000 jobs by 2015. Various reports have said that. If that could be replicated into Europe, that is massive stimulus at a time when Europe really needs jobs. Gas prices have clearly dropped significantly. We haven't seen that in Europe because, of course, the gas price is calculated in a different way, but there is no doubt that the gas price could come down in Europe if there is the boom, and also around energy security. I don't think we want to be anti-Russian here. I don't think that's helpful. But there's clearly at the moment a situation where Europe is in hock to the Russians, and the energy security argument has to be played. That is all about presenting the evidence. In terms of the second point, I think the critics do need to be rebutted and do need to be rebutted hard. I mean, to Gasland 1, there were a number of attempts by certain energy groups and certain energy NGOs to try and rebut it on a point-by-point basis. I don't think that really worked. I don't think Europe in particular was ready to rebut the emotion of Josh Fox. And there needs to be a clear story and a clear narrative that comes out, if Gasland 2 comes out, to rebut that story. I think, though, there has to be very clear listening to the arguments. It has to be really rebutted on a very, very careful basis. Because if one whips up the emotions here, we will be whipping up a further storm in Europe. Third, Alan mentioned the storm that's going on in Europe at the moment around decisions around regulation. I happen to believe that the shale gas industry, the oil and gas industry, the energy industry needs to agree to robust regulation around this. It is absolutely key to the message and to protecting the environment and to really neutralizing the fears around the environment. The oil and gas industry already rely on very strong regulation. And some people have argued, and I think it's not a bad idea, that in this early nascent form of dealing with deep European shale gas wells, there may well need to be some kind of kite marking system put in place to ensure that we do not get rogue independent operators who destroy the environment for everybody else. I think one needs to assemble the correct spokespeople. It's incredibly important. The Americans were slow to do this, but the American Natural Gas Alliance has really done a terrific job after a slow start. I think there needs to be a coordinated voice in Europe. That is the way to put together the message. Why has there been no coordinated voice? Well, it's because the industry really hasn't got going in Europe yet. There is nothing really to argue about. There is no interest for anyone to come forward and really put that. It's coming, and the coordinated voice needs to happen. I would like to see more CEOs out there talking about natural gas, the benefits of natural gas, and the benefits of natural gas from shale. If you look in our country, you look at Quadrilla and the CEO of Quadrilla, he's been very, very active. It has paid off dividends, and I think Quadrilla have done an exceptional job. I think politicians are extremely important. We're in a strange situation in the UK where we've moved from a Tory government that wants to be the greenest government to now a government that's looking only really at the dash for gas as the way, and I think Ford's onto something here around Thatcher, where they believe there may be some kind of balance sheet item in the future for them through gas. I think it's incredibly important to get the politicians on side and to make sure that they are arguing the right story. That means they need briefing correctly. That means we need a series of positive reports about the industry that show the potential, show jobs, show the economic benefits. I think the right audiences also need to be briefed. It's public relations 101. The NGO community need to be briefed clearly. There is no panacea here. They won't be on side. They all have good points to make, but they can at least be briefed on the arguments. The media as well. It's really strange to me, works in communications, that many companies don't even try to brief the media about some of the evidence that is out there and some of the operations that they're doing. It's a simple thing to do, and that needs to be done on a national level and a local level. I think in particular the investment community needs to be briefed very clearly. They're very smart, they're on top of a lot of the issues, but I think there needs to be a continuing dialogue with investors. Clearly there's been a drop-off in investment activity, and I think part of that is because people have realized that this is going to be a much slower burn than people have imagined, much slower indeed. And finally, I think the message has got to be crafted very carefully. We've talked about a rebuttal to Gasland. We've talked about lower gas prices, energy security. I think one of the keys here is about explaining to communities, to businesses, to regions and to countries in Europe that this could be a major industrial stimulus and competitiveness and job creation. And that is it's not an emotional message, it is a clear economic message. I think if we don't do that, if we don't manage to create that message, then the shale gas industry will actually could bypass Europe and move into emerging markets very quickly. And there is a severe risk over the next 5 to 10 years that Europe misses the opportunity to stimulate itself at the moment. Clearly, it's about lower emissions than coal, and that is an overwhelming argument. But there is also an argument that this is a bridging fuel to a more renewable future. And so I think shale gas can sit in the middle of that debate in a very strong central position. And I think one of the things as well that's happened around the message is that people have this villain now that's called shale gas. And I take what Ford said, absolutely. We need a little bit of rebranding here. This is not shale gas, it's natural gas from shale. And it's going to be the same for oil. And I think we just need to calmly explain the evidence, and shale could be a future for us in Europe.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, what I'm going to do now is we've got about half an hour, and I'd like to open it to the floor and see if we have any questions.
My name is Magda Jura, and I'm an executive MBA student here at LBS, so thank you very much for a very interesting panel discussion. I wanted to ask the panel if you have any views on using natural gas as a balancing fuel for renewables. I think that have we missed the boat on that in Europe when you look at what's happening in Germany, where there's so much electricity produced from renewables, but they're balancing with coal because it's so much cheaper than gas. And is this going to happen in Europe, and what can we do to bring that about? And is natural gas a good fuel to balance renewables?
Yes, I'll take that. The advantage of natural gas versus coal in terms of backing up the production of wind power, for instance, is that you can start and stop much quicker when you are producing with CCGT than with a coal power production unit. And that is very critical, because I'll give you an example. We in Spain have a lot of wind power installed. We are paying dear for it, by the way. But nevertheless, I remember one particular day when we had up to 80% of the power in the country produced by windmills. And in the same day, wind stops and production drops to 20%. That's huge. So you need to have a backup, and the best backup you can have is could be hydraulic, could be gas, but I wouldn't go for coal as a quick switch from wind power into other sources of power.
Any more questions?
I want to follow up on on the discussion that Simon was having about the PR challenges that the industry faces, because you do part from the base that everything that is said in a movie like Gasland is false. And certainly, if you watch the movie, it's clear that shale gas is not safe. I don't buy the argument. I don't buy the argument that it's such a dangerous option. But I also don't buy the argument that everything that the movie claims is false. There are some serious claims from serious entities that say, you know, there are environmental challenges to shale gas, and they have to be looked at. So the debate has kind of become, on the one hand, either you hate the earth, or you're an ignorant guy who has been duped by this guy who made a movie, and you hate jobs. So, you know, trying to set the record straight in this neutral environment, what is the truth about the environmental issues related to water contamination? What is the truth about the earthquake claim? And most importantly, what is the truth about methane leakage? Because if that is true, then all of the arguments about the fuel being a transition fuel are false. So if we can clear the record once and for all in terms of environmental claims, what is it?
Well, I tell you, I actually deal with this because I've actually gone through. I've sadly, because I'm very sad and I read all the papers. I've read a lot of this. What I suggest is anyone who wants to look at this. There's a Royal Society produced a paper on hydraulic fracturing and its impact, which goes through. And I run a course, Global Energy Policy and the Law, on my master's program. And I give that to the students to start with. It provides the broadest overview of all the issues and gives you access to all of the academic literature which is related to it. So I think that's where I would start. Now, there are environmental issues with shale gas. They're unfortunately not discussed in the Gasland film. The difficulty is what they were focusing on was hydraulic fracturing. And frankly, that is never really the problem. Like all oil and gas development, the fundamental issues with oil and gas development are the security of the wellhead. That is the concrete and steel funnel from the surface through the subwater, through the water table, and then down to the rock below. And if that's secure, then pretty much everything else will be secure as well. And that is really fundamentally the major environmental issue. The second environmental issue, again, not really discussed in Gasland, is the classic environmental issue of flowback water and the protection of flowback waters. And those are the two environmental things. But that's not shale gas, that's any oil and gas development anywhere in the world, pretty much, you're going to have those sort of issues. And that's what you're going to focus on. And Gasland focuses on fracking, which of itself is not a major question. In relation to all of this, I say the Royal Society paper is probably the most comprehensive. It goes through everything in some detail, provides you with an enormous amount of academic literature as well to back it up. The issue, if you mentioned earthquakes, the earthquakes in the northwest of England when Quadrilla started doing their exploratory fracking were on the range of 1.4 to 2.2 on the Richter scale, or thereabouts. Now, this is the level of a seismic event which could be described as a cat flap flapped in Lancashire. It's an incredibly minor seismic event. Now, the coal disturbance from old coal mines in England is greater than anything that is perceived on that. And again, if you look at the Royal Society paper, they go through they give you a table, an analysis from about 1290 to 2012, because we have records going apparently back that far, of all the seismic events in the United Kingdom. And you get some sense of the minor nature of this, and even when they assess the potential scale of it, it's incredibly minor. There isn't. I mean, we do have of course, mad press reports that Dublin is going to be hit by a huge tidal wave as the northwest of England sinks into the Irish Sea. Now, That's not true, of course, but neither is it true that there is going to be cracks in the road or whatever. There is no evidence of that anywhere in the world. And the United States, remember, has done 1 million fracks since 1947. And there is the evidence to support this damage is not there. And let me give you another legal way of looking at it. The United States has the most effective tort liability system on earth. The lawyers can get up to 30% of the damages. If there was a serious problem with shale gas after 1 million fracks, the US tort bar would have dropped on the US shale gas industry in no uncertain terms. And I was talking with one plaintiff litigator on this recently, and he said to me, Alan, if there was a problem, we would be there. Now, there is no indication. Yes, there are a whole series, and I can go through, there's an entire litany of issues to deal with shale gas in terms of environment which need to be dealt with. A major one is scalability, but there are a number of others in terms of water treatment plants and waste treatment plants and what you need to have in place, and there are all these sort of questions. But the ones that have been pulled up into Gasland are just not they're just not made out. So hopefully that's a very answer. But I say the Royal Society paper, if you put Royal Society and hydraulic fracturing in Google, the paper comes up. You can read it yourself.
Thank you, Professor Riley. My question, I think, would start with Ford, and it goes back to his discussion about the global politics and Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher's fame, Ford, wasn't so much the North Sea oil, but sending our fleet, not the Sixth Fleet, the only fleet we had, to the Malvinas, Falklands, because the people who couldn't pay the debt thought they could survive by attacking some islands. The Americans, of course, are withdrawing from the Middle East, we know that. Some say it didn't work. And the Sixth Fleet will no longer need to be there because it needn't protect the supply of the American oil industry. China now is expanding at a faster rate than the British Empire did in going to the place like Africa to do deals so it can make sure it's guaranteed raw materials for its industry. Raw materials, forget religion for the moment for this argument, raw materials, of course, so many wars in the world. With your analysis of what's happening to the balance of power and the change of the shape of the American interest, they're going elsewhere now other than the Middle East, how will that affect the Chinese and their interest in promoting what is a fantastic looking economy? You know, what will that do when they are looking for those resources?
At a geopolitical level, I'm actually part of the International Crisis Group, and I immerse myself in geopolitics and energy almost as a hobby. And I just came back from Beirut last night, got in at 3 o'clock in the morning. I look at China very carefully. I've sold 2 companies to the Chinese in the last 20 years. I've seen them evolve and change the way they're operating. There's a lot of press here in Europe about how they operate in Africa. 12 years ago, certainly I don't think the case today, I remember seeing 747s landing in Luanda with the windows all closed and chain gangs coming off them. That's certainly not the case today. Kazakhstan, there was an enormous amount of labor pools coming in, assets being grabbed. What we've seen, and again, talking to the investment banks too, what we've seen is a constant evolution. I think there was talking about photovoltaic cells. There's a constant evolution. The Chinese seem to get better and better at everything they do. I remember as a child seeing goods made in Hong Kong or Japan as being garbage, and today some of the best in the world. I think the Chinese will continue to evolve and learn. In terms of energy consumption, they're learning too. They have taken a different approach to the more Western European, or European and North American way. And I carefully applaud how they've been learning. They've stepped into countries, and rather than displace entire governments, they have built bridges, built roads, built dams, not provided cash incentives, but actual hard assets to countries as their first step in trying to acquire assets. They have learned that it's more difficult to produce oil and gas than initially thought to step around the world. They're finding that they're taking over fields from, again, Kazakhstan to formerly Syria now, where they're seeing the production come up, and as soon as they take over, the field starts to fall off. So I think what they're going to try and do, and my sense is, it'd be interesting to talk to even Statoil too about this, my sense is that they're going to start changing their format of acquiring energy to a more passive role. They want the reserves on the books, but they're not going to try and operate as much. I think there's going to be an evolution over the next 5 years. When I went to Beijing 4 years ago, there was a woman who was in charge of the nuclear industry there, and she was actually in tears about their needs and requirements and the enormous hurdle of the construction program that she had to undertake. She likened it, in fact, to having to build nuclear power plants like McDonald's stores, that there just wasn't enough energy that they could grab around the world at that certain pace of growth, and that they were going to have to go to a nuclear pace, that the shale for them was a maybe. They weren't certain. There's some great fields there, but they weren't sure that they were going to be able to get all the technology. I think the Chinese will be an enormous factor for all of us. But my brother's in the coal-fired power plant business, and he said to me, the coal-fired power plants being built in China, the new ones being built in China today, have the finest flue gas desulfurization systems in the world on the back end for super clean burning coal. The problem is that the two plants, let's say 2 plants in a city, are competitive, and one of them turns the back end of the plant off. So the systems are in place, but they're not actually running the lime slaking systems through the back end. It's just an evolution. And my sense is that they will step around the world a little more carefully than they have for the last 10 years. And if they can look at the bigger picture that there's just not enough energy out there, that my sense is that it won't become a military threat, but there will be a concern that they want to try and generate as much internally from sustainable, and I would guess more nuclear. My bet is that they will go to a nuclear format.
I would just add something from the investment perspective. I think I'm surprised that it's taken us an hour actually to discuss China in the context of global energy. I mean, China is the driver of global energy demand, and anything we do around supply is with a view to, well, where is China's demand going to be? I would actually disagree with Ford in terms of his perspective around Chinese companies perhaps not operating or not evolving into being operators. Actually, what I think is, and we're seeing it, I think, Chinese companies are learning incredibly quickly, are moving forward and becoming operators. At the moment, we're seeing the Chinese national offshore oil company, CNOOC, in the throes of trying to acquire Nexen, one of Canada's largest oil companies, for $17–18 billion. And with that, they're not simply going to acquire assets, they're going to acquire people and human resources that they can deploy around the world, including China, when we haven't talked about Chinese shale resources, which are enormous and potentially transformational. And if we just think about the NOCs and shale, 6% of Chinese energy consumption or energy power generation is provided by gas at the moment. It's 6% compared to 55% maybe in the US and growing. If you just think of if shale gas in China becomes a reality, the amount of displacement of coal in China, which is of course the big source of electricity, and oil, is dramatic. And I think my perception and what we're seeing in reality is that the Chinese companies are trying to learn those operating skills by buying companies or joint venturing with companies internationally, by bringing international companies like Shell and other companies to China to joint venture with them to learn the technology and try and create their own shale industry. Now, there are huge logistical challenges to that. China's a huge country. It has a very nascent oilfield services industry. The distances that the pipeline networks are still very, very nascent. But if they apply themselves and they put money to work, I think the impact could be dramatic on the global energy balance and the self-sufficiency of China, which is not something I think we see any time in our lifetimes, but certainly the ability for China to move towards a more gas economy is absolutely enormous.
Just to put another dimension to this is time. If you look at the resources that China has in terms of shale gas, the US holds like 22% of the 42,000 TCF of total shale gas reserves estimated in the world. China holds 30%, which is huge. And the difference is that depending on who you ask, they might be 10 to 20 years behind the US, like everybody else in the world, by the way, because at the end of the day, last year, the US produced 12 TCF of gas from shale gas, which is 97% of all the unconventional gas produced in the world. And they have like 2,000 drills for shale gas, whereas in Europe, we have like 125, and only 25 of them are able to perform lateral horizontal drills. So basically, whatever happens is not going to happen tomorrow. But given what has been said, which I fully subscribe in terms of their ability to learn and their willingness to open the country for technology, because although they are not allowing foreign companies in general to touch their energy industry, they are very willing to form joint ventures in shale gas development. And that will speed the process, but you need to develop huge infrastructure. You look at the US, they have performed like 20,000 wells since the year 2000, and you cannot improvise that. It takes an awful lot of time to develop the infrastructure. They don't have the pipelines. That is a huge investment that will be needed. And they have the money. They cannot have the time straight away.
Yeah, I think just would like to add some factoids here, because I think they're relevant for kind of the way we perceive these opportunities. I often think there's kind of, we tend to talk of once in a while about shale assets, kind of given that you will have a development in Europe, given that you will have a development in China. Just to remind ourselves, the shale industry is very young. Statoil, we were the first, I think, international big company that entered shale gas in the US. That was only 4 years ago. Shale oil, kind of as a concept, was kind of had a breakthrough, I would say, 2-3 years ago. We entered in 2010, and then I guess we were in the middle of the group of international companies going to the US. In the US, till now, it has been drilled about 34,000 dedicated shale wells, 34,000. The total number of shale wells in Europe till now is about 50. The total number of shale wells dedicated in China till now, as kind of according to our statistics and our sources, is about 60. It is simply kind of still a bit too early to say that, yes, we will have significant developments kind of outside US. We think it's likely. I did say that Europe cannot replicate US. China, I think it's fair to say, they can. They have the potential resources that can be converted maybe into reserves, but it is too early still to say. I think that's what we need to say. And the same goes other places in the world. In Europe, we still don't have, I think, something we would call a proven commercial shale discovery. We still haven't seen that, proven commercial, because there are a number of factors that needs to be in the place. But I do think that there will be, for sure. But we haven't yet, we can't tick that off yet.
Yep, so I'm Gaisa, London Business School MBA. So I have a question regarding the China. So it's regarding what is your view on long-term, what is your projection for long-term success of IOCs in China? Because there are some talks that actually once the Chinese NOCs actually crack the code, there won't be any kind of new exploration licenses and kind of things. They're kind of willing to learn. So this is the first question. So what is because for shale gas you need a scale. And second question, what is your view on the Henry Hub price in future? I mean, do you see the recovery because of lower supply, because less companies drill less at the moment?
Just a kind of short answer. I think what we have seen with China is that they seem to become more accommodating. towards foreign companies coming kind of with shale competence. We feel there has been a kind of development in the sense that they now had a second shale round, kind of where they had in November, December, and they are kind of very more encouraging to kind of for foreign companies. And also see with regulation is also getting more kind of easier for foreign companies. And when it comes to regulation, just to make one point, I think for a big company, also a small company, regulation is often quite good, even if it's strict, because then it's predictable. You know what you have to kind of deal with. Uncertainty is the worst, in a way, we can have. So just we have seen that the Chinese have kind of progressed, they've come with regulation, and so that's a positive development, I would say, as we see it.
Okay. Any other comments on Henry Hub or China? No?
Henry Hub. Well, it's very difficult to forecast what will happen, but when you look at the production cost structure of the different areas, producing areas in the US, you realize that there is an enormous amount of reserves that are economic and break-even at the level of $3-4. And I'm talking dry gas. But what happens is that a lot of drills are moving into wet gas areas. And when you hit an area with wet gas, which means liquids, which means oil equivalent pricing, then gas price is irrelevant because it is a byproduct. So it's very hard to see Henry Hub going in the future above the level of $5 to $6.
So my name's Robin Walker, and I work for Schlumberger, which people who maybe don't know if you're not in the oil and gas industry, but we do a lot of the technical work, which for companies like Statoil. So, and I'm a geologist by training, although now I'm doing business, involved in business. But the technology, I would echo what the board's saying. It's a very, very young industry, whether it's gas or oil. And at the moment, our chairman famously said that fracking is brute force and ignorance. And at the moment, largely it is brute force and ignorance, but our ability to understand what we're doing, predict what we're doing, and characterize where we're going is going to escalate amazingly in the next 5 to 10 years. And so I think really in answer to the question from up there, I don't think it is anywhere near as dangerous as the emotion puts out, but I do also echo Simon's point and the work that Quadrilla is doing. I happen to live 10 miles from one of the development areas, and my mother-in-law lives 10 miles from the other one, and I don't need to worry about my old age pension because I'll be dead if I believed everything that's written. So we do have a struggle. As an industry, we have a struggle, but it will get amazingly better, which means also that our ability to produce only from sweet spots and not just drill every half a mile or whatever, which we do today, will change a lot in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, Grímur Björnsson from Reykjavík Geothermal. I am fascinated that you seem to be engineering permeability at great depths, maybe below 2 or 3 kilometers. So it's like a future question. Will you see that shale gas industry is going to be geothermal in another 50 years?
Permeability at 2 or 3 kilometers is what your point was? Yeah, we're fracking. We're fracking at that depth right now. We're fracking, absolutely. I mean, there was a lot of talk about, oh, shales are much deeper in Europe and it's so much more difficult and so on. U.S. and our Ardmore, I think our deepest Ardmore well is around 15,000 feet, 14,000 feet. Right? So you've got a lateral length of almost 20,000 with another 5,000 feet of lateral out there. It's just horsepower.
Ford, is it hot fracking?
Is it hot fracking? Well, the downhole temperatures are higher, yeah. I mean, we're not pumping in hot liquid. Does that answer your question? For his, well, his temperature, you're always looking at that temperature very carefully. But the idea of, yeah, you need, so you can get it to boiling temperature, right, to steam. I think about that in terms of, from a steam turns to water at around, what is it, 3,000 feet? 3 to 5,000 feet? And that's why steam-assisted gravity drainage goes to goes to hell on you when you get blown.
need to go down to about 2 kilometers.
Yeah, we're at that depth now.
We will have this
Absolutely.
technical discussion further over coffee. I'm
Sorry.
going to ask one more question of this gentleman over here.
Yeah. We heard a lot about a lot of good issues. So we had regulatory issues that shale gas faces, so that needs to evolve. Community issues, that buying needs to happen in different areas and different localities. Europe certainly has a way to go on that. And then there are environmental issues on that, and particularly if you're drilling thousands of wells to get shale out, which are short life wells, then you have a lot of investment that goes into this, and if you have to complete them and pack them and with the same amount of things for the environmental to be for containment, then it also means a lot of cost. So Atle briefly touched on that commercial viability hasn't been proven. Could you elaborate more on what's happening on the commercial front in the Europe? As in, are there more areas, acreages that are being tested, and as in how many areas do we think are actually commercially viable, because they might be of different depth to what US is, and how's the economical viability of reserves in Europe?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, sure.
I'm chair of a company. We have 5 million acres in Europe that we bought relatively cheap 5 years ago when nobody was paying attention. But just to answer your question about costs, and there's a lot of those who are even pro-gas or shale gas in Europe are very concerned that the costs are going to be exorbitantly higher and may offset the substantially different and higher price, oil index pricing, if you will, gas price here in Europe. But we also look at it in terms of being able to do, because the land is held by the state, subsurface, and I concur that there needs to be some royalty or structure that goes to some of the landowners on location. You're limited in the US to drilling a well that covers 1 mile, effectively, by a 640-acre parcel, farmer to farmer. In Europe, when you can buy effectively a 200,000-acre parcel in one block, you can do what's called pad drilling, where on a single location, you can drill, let's say, 4 to 6 wells, down 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6. So you've got economies of scale at drilling it out here, number one. And your length of your lateral well, if you can follow me here, but the length of the lateral well can be beyond that 5,000 feet. You could go to 7 or 10 or 12,000 feet. So in fact, in our calculation, we believe that the wells in Europe will be cheaper on a per frac stage basis than the ones in the US. Okay? Now you still have to factor in costs of the land cost and some of the other component pieces, but we think, to the point of sort of an evolution of technology and capacity, that a lot of the things that have been learned in combination with some of the regulations in Europe will allow for some very, very small footprint component places where you can produce an enormous amount of gas once you've found a structure that works. There's many, many basins in Europe, many, many shale basins, and I put to you the economics of what's going to work and how many wells will ultimately sort themselves out are limited by the equipment, they're limited by the testing, Schlumberger's core lab work. It takes some time. But once you've found a shale basin that works, it's a repeatable event. You just roll them through.
I'd also just say, you ask if there are other basins or how they measure up. The problem is we don't know. France, which is potentially one of the most exciting countries in Europe from a shale gas and unconventional oil and gas perspective, after Poland perhaps, fracking, as you know, is banned at the moment. Bulgaria, fracking is banned. So until politicians become comfortable with the concept of fracking and shale gas exploration and development, we're not going to be able to test some of the most prospective basins. One thing I would also add, just from the capital markets perspective, we've seen a huge reduction in the value of the shale gas companies focused in Europe over the past 24 months, say 18 months even. I think there's been an element of naivety among investors. The assumption was that Europe was just like the US, just a couple of years behind, and there was a huge exuberance behind share prices. Then investors went exactly the other way and said, actually, Europe's nothing like the US, and it never will be, because it's got so many political issues and so many other issues, and France and Bulgaria were always highlighted as reasons behind their negativity. I think what we're going to see ultimately is some form of middle ground where I think investors will understand that there is actually a viable shale gas industry in Europe. It is going to take a very long time in comparison to the US for a whole variety of reasons, and companies will be valued accordingly. But I think today we've seen a lot, the investment community has turned its back almost on the European shale story for reasons that I think are frankly not necessarily valid.
Atle, you want to point?
Yeah, I think I just want to say I agree with Ford when it comes to the costs. I'm not afraid of the costs. I mean, they will be driven down by the supply industry, I'm pretty sure. So that will not be a problem. I think, as Ford mentioned, the key is to find the structures that work. And that will take some time because it's not just like drilling one well. Normally you cannot conclude. You need to drill some more and it will take some time and you need to crack the code for each individual shale play. That's how it works. So it will take some time, it will take some money. And from a financing perspective, that's of course can be challenging because there can be some timing this and so on. So you need to, maybe this favors of the big company in some ways, but the small companies, they are the ones who can move quickly on the ground and maybe know the local issues and local opportunities. So this is what we're seeing today, that the big companies like ourselves and smaller companies, we're working kind of together, I think, in some kind of partnerships that evolve as we speak.
Yuri Wyschowski, Astor Capital, and more importantly, London Business School alumni. Actually, two kind of clarifying questions following the discussion. One regarding impact of shale oil and gas, and now is regarding nuclear. On the gas issue as such, if you look about 40% of world gas reserves are in Russia, and if you look within Russia, it's in a very remote areas, very far from infrastructure. And recently, you've probably seen that Gazprom announced that it's actually dropped development of one very large offshore gas field because originally it was planned for U.S. market, to build
a Stockton field, yeah.
Yeah, and there are some other developments also now being questioned. So my question is actually don't you think there's a risk of if I don't know if it's true or not, but if shale gas is indeed a bubble, and if expectations are too high, don't you think there's a risk of larger developments being dropped, and then in a medium or longer term perspective, what it would mean, there will be price escalation because there won't be enough supply. And second question was regarding nuclear. We've seen how Germany reacted following Fukushima disaster, and also Lithuania, there was a referendum, where people voted recently no, in respect of development of nuclear station where. But at the same time, today you mentioned several times that nuclear is answer possibly in US following with shale gas contraction, possible contraction. It's maybe answer in China. But in Europe also, for example, in UK, a few consortia announced exit from UK market, not actually announcing that they're not going to build a nuclear station in UK. Again, don't you also think there's a risk of this kind of again overreaction, and then there's again will be less supply, so to speak, and again the risk is that your consumer will suffer because there will be big mismatch between supply and demand, and there will be price escalation. Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone want to have a go at that?
I can have a go at the first question around gas bubble.
Yeah.
Look, I think your premise that the shale gas could be a bubble, I don't fundamentally agree with. It may be a bubble in terms of pricing, maybe a bubble. It may be lower today, and the cost of gas today, maybe the price of gas may be lower today than it will be in the future. But it's there. The technology is there to extract it. There's no reason why it won't be extracted. Bearing in mind that, by and large, the importance of shale gas to the international markets is when it becomes an export fuel, or when it displaces LNG from the US market. We're already seeing a lot of displacement of LNG from the US market, but that presumes that there is no other source of LNG, or there aren't other incremental sources of LNG. We're finding gas in a whole new series of regions today in comparison to 3-5 years ago. The US could be one of the largest gas exporters in the world, potentially, but that's potentially a big if. But there are countries like Tanzania, Mozambique, Israel, Argentina, many other countries which have massive gas resources, many of them conventional resources, which are going to be supporting the incremental gas demand in the future. So I don't think that in the next 10, 15 years we run the risk of a squeeze on prices because of a gas bubble in the US. I just don't think that's a plausible theory. I think there is a lot of gas out there looking for contracts at the moment and looking for contracts in the next 10, 15 years before we run into that.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I think we've got to really pack up at this point. We don't want to hog shale for the rest of the conference. But I'd like to thank the panel. That was a really great and comprehensive view of a lot of the issues. Thanks very much for the audience for your questions. And I think we'll finish it there. Thank you very much.
Yeah.